Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to Mormon Sex Info. This is Natasha Helfer-Parker, and today I can't tell you how thrilled I am to have Dr. Laurie Mintz with me. She is the author of a book called Becoming Cliterate, among other things that she's done as well. I think this is very apropos given that yesterday was International Women's Day. So granted, this probably won't come out for a few weeks after that since we do edit interviews and things of that nature, but I'm excited to talk about women and clitorises and, just the fabulousness of all of that. So just to give a little bit more of an intro, Dr. Mintz is a college professor at the University of Florida. She teaches the psychology of human sexuality to hundreds of students a year and has had over 20 years of experience working with private clients on sexual issues. She's received many professional and teaching awards and has published over 50 research studies. I didn't know that actually until I read some of your bio this morning, so that's really interesting. Has been quoted extensively in a lot of media outlets like Psychology Today blog, Parenting Magazine, Cosmopolitan, Prevention, Women's Day, Women's Health, CNN, Oprah, and the Huffington Post. So I'm just so honored to have you on the program. Thank you so much for taking time to be with us today.
I'm excited to be on the program. Thank you for asking me to be on the program.
Well, tell us a little bit more about yourself. How do you come to be in this line of work, and how do you get to have the bio you have?
I feel really, really fortunate the way that things have unfolded in my career. Just to make a long story short, I'm, studied to be a, licensed psychologist. And I ended up taking an academic job, and that's where all those research articles came from. And I always had a private practice on the side. And, I was very fortunate to have been raised in a really sex-positive household. So sex was always a very comfortable topic for me. And it's almost one of those realizations other people aren't so comfortable with this. So, I was mostly always asked my clients about sexual issues. And of course, once you ask and open that door, then the floodgates open. And so that's when I thought I really want to spread the word, more broadly beyond my, classroom, my clients, and write about this for the popular press. So that's sort of where I am. And I really feel just a huge passion for helping women embrace sexuality and sexual pleasure. And that's not to say I don't feel the same for men or for gender nonconforming folks. I mean, I want everyone to have pleasure. My specific specialty, though, is helping women have sexual pleasure.
Yeah, you do talk about that a lot throughout the book, is this idea that you're not not wanting men to experience pleasure or, prioritize somehow women's orgasms over men's. And at the same time, you're bringing up what you call the orgasm problem or the orgasm gap. So can you tell us a little bit about the statistics in regards to how women are experiencing sexual pleasure and orgasm and how men typically experience that in our current culture?
Yes, I'm happy to tell you those statistics. But first, I want to thank you for pointing out that you picked that up, that I say that throughout the book. By elevating women's pleasure, I'm not diminishing men's pleasure. I'm just trying to close the orgasm gap, because I have been misunderstood as saying the opposite, that I'm trying to turn the tables. No, I want equality for all. And as I say in the book, there can't be true quality without equality. Mm-hmm. And that goes in all realms, including the sexual. And to answer your questions, we don't currently have orgasm equality. Just a few really striking statistics, and there's more. But these are studies where you're talking about women and men having a sexual encounter. And in one study of college students, they didn't ask the type of sex. Was it relationship sex? Was it casual sex? So we don't currently have this type of equality. In one study of university students where they didn't ask the type of sex, casual or relationship, get this, 91% of men versus 39% of women report always or usually experiencing an orgasm with a partner. Now, while this study didn't ask the context of the sexual encounter, was it the type of casual sex that some college students are engaging in, or was it relationship sex? When that differentiation is made in casual sex, 55% of men versus 4% of women say they always orgasm during first-time hookup sex. So one might think, okay, things are bad with casual sex, which has a whole, obviously, we could talk about that in terms of, is that okay, and all that value stuff. But what I want to say most importantly is that gap narrows, but it doesn't disappear in relationship sex. In one study, 85% of men versus 68% of women said they'd orgasm during their last sexual encounter that occurred in the context of a committed relationship. And basically, what we find is that on average, men are in relationships having 3 orgasms to every female orgasm.
Right. Okay. And this, pretty much from an anecdotal perspective matches my clinical experience, right? Working with Mormons, and primarily Mormons as my clientele. And so I think it's important to talk about this because I think from adding the Mormon perspective, one is that relational sex is really important in Mormonism. And I think that we have some really great sex positive ideas in Mormonism in the regard that we definitely make room for sexuality being part of the relational bonding and loving and pleasure experience. We're not one of those religions where it's like procreation only or things of that nature. And I think that for the most part, we really prioritize relational equality, even though we have some issues with patriarchy, but we do prioritize, or at least talk about the importance of men and women having a say in their marriage. When I talk to Mormon men, and you talk about this in your book quite a bit, men typically want the women in their life, the woman who's important to them, to experience sexual pleasure. He wants to be a conduit for that, right? To be helpful in that regard. And oftentimes what we also find is that women are faking it. So do you want to talk a little bit about that? Why are women faking, especially in relational context? So here's, somebody that you love and somebody that you want to have a relationship with, but you're not necessarily being honest about the pleasure that you're experiencing.
Yes, and I see that a lot in my practice too, and in workshops. And I've had talk to women who faked it for over 30 years. That was the longest time. And it was so sad and striking. And especially in the context of, this person wants me to have pleasure. And when women fake it, my experience is it's always during intercourse. Maybe there's an occasional faking it during some other activity, but it's by and large, the vast majority of faking occurs during intercourse. And that is because either they believe that's how they're supposed to orgasm. They have bought into that myth that intercourse is supposed to be the best way to orgasm. And perhaps their partners have bought into that same myth that if they're a good lover, they will bring their partner to orgasm with their penis during intercourse. And so they fake so that they're not appearing abnormal, and they fake to prevent their partners from having hurt feelings, from feeling like he didn't do a good job. And that's really what I find. And the sad part is that by faking, they're training their partners to do exactly what doesn't work for them.
That's right. No, that I would totally second that. The protection piece in particular is what's so tragic, right? Because we do this out of love and out of, I don't want to hurt his feelings. I don't want to make it difficult. And yet that whole process makes it difficult for everybody involved. You talk about sex versus intercourse. Can you tell me a little bit about that? How we use those words and why isn't intercourse the best idea for female orgasm?
Yeah, and I love that. Thank you for asking the question about the linguistics, because I feel so passionate about the words we use. And in our culture, sex is used as synonymous with intercourse. And even articles in magazines, always we see these articles, the best sex positions for her orgasm. And again, they're equating sex as the most important act. Intercourse as the most important act, and anything that comes before, foreplay, just to get her ready for this important act. And the real truth of the matter is, now it depends on the study and how the question is asked, but basically only somewhere between 4 and 18% of women say that their easiest or most reliable route to orgasm is intercourse. That instead, anatomically, the clitoris is our hotspot, our most orgasmic organ. And I can get into details, but the bottom line is the clitoris is only indirectly stimulated through intercourse. And sometimes it's not stimulated at all. And there's different biology. Some women have their clitoris farther from their vaginal opening, etc. But the 95% of women say their most reliable route to orgasm is clitoral stimulation, either alone, no intercourse involved, or coupled with intercourse, coupling the two. And in fact, this is something I include in the book that I've not heard other people talk about, but I've had many women tell me, I cannot orgasm with a penis inside my vagina. It's distracting. I need complete focus on clitoral stimulation. And women know and I know we were going to talk about this later, I'll just say, women know how to pleasure themselves when they masturbate. 94% of women orgasm when they masturbate. And most women don't insert anything when they masturbate. The vast majority focus externally, but when with a partner, we give up that sense of what we know we need and focus on intercourse as the main act. So that's...
Yeah, so where does that come from? Where do you think that comes from, this idea that sex is penis, vagina, intercourse, and, what cultural, historical factors are we dealing with?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I'm so glad to talk about that. Obviously, penis, vagina, intercourse is how we procreate. So, we can say it comes from that, but a lot of people, myself included, have said that may be where it started, that may be part of it, but that doesn't account for the persistent way that female pleasure has been considered secondary. I think we can trace it, back to Greek and Roman, and I have a chapter in the book all about history and Freud, talking about the vaginal versus clitoral orgasm. So I think that it's historical, but it's more than just procreation. I think it's a privileging of male sexuality. And by that, what I mean is when we culturally privilege one group over the other, we assuming, and I'm not saying individual men are doing this. I do not blame individual men. But as a culture, when we privilege one group, right, we say their experience is the default, standard, normal human experience. And so men orgasm most reliably from intercourse. So we kind of sort of take that, well, that's then, if men do that, that's the way humans do that. And we extend that to women. So I think that it goes very, very deep into a cultural privileging of males' ways of orgasm.
I love your language of most reliable way to orgasm. I really like that term. I want everybody to start using it. What's my most reliable way of orgasm? Because first of all, it depicts that there's lots of different ways that we can have an orgasm. And back to the point of, sex doesn't have to mean one particular act. And I also think that it really offers this idea that we may be very different in how we may reliably orgasm, and making room for that. Can you talk a little bit more about foreplay not being this like pre-sex act?
Yes. And, there's such a cultural press to orgasm during intercourse that, I'll answer that question, but I'll also want to add on, we talked about research studies, but when you ask women, do you orgasm during intercourse? More say yes. than when you ask them, what's your most reliable route to orgasm? Because even the way you ask that question, it sort of privileges, this is how you should be doing it, are you? Well, we're all going to say yes, even if it only happened once. But if we ask the most reliable route, then it opens the door to say, what is best for my body? So foreplay, right? We have this cultural script that about sex, foreplay, just to get her ready for intercourse, male orgasm, sex over. And so foreplay is considered this act we go through to get the woman ready for the main act. And in fact, two things about foreplay. One is most couples today are rushing through that and not arousing the woman enough for intercourse. And that is a major cause of painful intercourse, because it takes a woman anywhere from like 20 to 45 minutes to be aroused enough to have a penis go in her vagina, to be lubricated enough for her cervix to pull up out of the way. And so that's one piece of it. But the other piece is, when we start thinking about sex as a turn-taking model, she comes first and then he comes. Or there's she can come through manual stimulation and oral sex, and then there can be intercourse. Or we can have oral sex, manual stimulation enough to have her aroused for intercourse, and then she can come from stimulation after with a hand or a vibrator or whatever. And so if we stop thinking about foreplay as what leads up to the act and start thinking about the whole thing as sex, and then start using more specific words, oral sex, intercourse, it really opens up the idea that this is a more equitable, equal sexual encounter.
Yeah, I love that. I talk often about what is considered successful sex, and all the messages that we get through the media, just like we get messages about what's a successful body type. And most of us don't fit those types of, I guess, the classic personifications of what those things symbolize. And so kind of reclaiming who gets to be sexy, right? And what type of sex gets to be the right type of sex. And you mentioned this in the book, that one of the main complaints women come in with is that, why am I not having an orgasm through intercourse? Help me figure that out. And when I ask questions like, well, are you having orgasms, or are there other ways that you're having orgasms? Many times they're saying, yes, I am having those. So what? Who cares? Because I'm not having this type of orgasm, and that's the type of orgasm I should be having. So it really does come with a lot of cultural backdrop. And I think you also mentioned, there's obviously like Freud had something to say about the right type of orgasm. We've had all kinds of historical things that, in a sense, almost like, the clitoris is like an inadequate penis. We have those types of historical issues where women's sexuality was always seen as either immature or childlike, or not as strong or not as viable as men's sexuality. We can go back millennia and find those types of messages that we're still, I think, in a sense, trying to fight off.
I could not agree more. And that's right. Like, women really have this, I should do it this way. And it's very analogous to, I didn't make this metaphor in the book, but I remember talking about it with my editor, that it is very analogous to this, what you're bringing up about appearance. We have these messages about how you should look, and maybe 1 or 2% of the population look that way without airbrushing, and, but we all think we should. And the same with orgasms from intercourse, like really about the same amount of percentage, have that experience, and reliably, consistently. We all think we should be that way. And then, movies show that. I mean, I don't, any sex scene in a movie, you watch it and, they are both having orgasms from intercourse. So I think that there's so much shoulding on ourselves that we do. And even the G-spot, I think the hype around the G-spot really set us back to an era where women are searching for that magical spot inside their vagina that will result in orgasm, when really all the nerve endings that women need to orgasm are on the outside, not the inside.
Yeah. And can you talk a little bit about then slightly just the anatomy of women. I mean, I remember being at BYU and feeling this incredible anger as I sat in a family life class. And it was the first time, I was probably about 20 years old, where the female anatomy was being explained to me, and just feeling this anger that I was 20 years old and not understanding that I had all these different parts. And I'm not sure if that was unique, like I'm not sure everybody at BYU takes that class or if, there's just not, we don't get pleasure-centric sexual education, in the United States. And so most of the parts that we're aware of are the reproductive parts. Even in looking through some of your images and, graphs or diagrams in your book, kind of even gave it even more perspective, like, oh yeah, that is where the clitoral bulbs are. Like, that's not, most people are like, wait, the clitoris, much less the clitoral bulbs. And most people don't even understand what the clitoris looks like or how intricate or how much it stretches into the female anatomy. They just see it as this little tiny button on top of the, mons pubis. So
exactly.
You want to talk a little bit about just educating women and their anatomy and men along with that?
I would love to. Most, like about a quarter of women and a quarter of men can't locate the clitoris on a diagram. There was a research study, and that's actually not surprising, because you're right. Our sex education system is so lacking when it comes to female anatomy and pleasure. Very few sex education programs mention the clitoris, and this drives me crazy, the fact that we call our entire anatomy a vagina, because, and even, something like, the Vagina Monologues, which is a feminist play that's supposed to raise awareness of women's genitals, yet they're not calling it by the right name. And the vagina is an important anatomical area, but it's just a part of our genital anatomy. The outside is called the vulva, and that's where our nerve endings are, but we don't even know that word. And really, it's like saying, oh, well, if you think of the metaphor of like, well, I could call my nose my eye. It doesn't really matter. They're both on my face.
Right.
It erases, by calling the vulva of everything a vagina, it erases, linguistically silences and erases our most erotic organ. And while this may sound a little radical, it also goes back to that privileging of male sexuality and making female sexuality less important, because we're calling our genitals by the part that's more sexually useful to men than it is to us.
That's right. Yeah. And let me just quote you. You say, we label sex as the act through which most men reach orgasm. We label women's genitals by the one part, the vagina, through which most men reach orgasm. We elevate men's sexual organ, the penis, with countless nicknames that no longer seem strange to us, but we have no word with which to comfortably name the clitoris. So yeah, it just really is alarming a bit that not only do we have like this amazingly complex female anatomy going on, that was part of what I was so fascinated by. I was like, wait, how many parts do I have? And wait, what's going on? Quote unquote down there.
Yes.
and just being fascinated. And even the clitoris, I knew what the clitoris was back then because I was told back then, but I didn't understand the actual like legs that it has that reaches deeper into my, kind of like it flanks my vaginal walls. Mm-hmm. I didn't know that until probably just like 4 years ago or something, through my education becoming a sex therapist. So it's just fascinating to me how little we know still about female anatomy.
Yeah. And it's so interesting. It's so true. So many people, I have this necklace that is a clitoris necklace, and people are like, what is that? Because we don't know what it is. And you're right. It's mostly an internal organ. We don't even know those parts, and we don't say the word out loud. We know so little about it. And in fact, the first MRI of the clitoris wasn't done till the 1990s, and the first 3D sonogram wasn't done till about 2005. So scientifically, we're just at our infancy in really understanding how powerful this organ we have is. And it is the only organ in all of human anatomy that has no function besides pleasure. And Masters and Johnson were the first to say that, but it's so important to underscore that. Men's penises bring them great pleasure, but they also urinate from them. They also have other functions. But the clitoris is a unique organ in all of human anatomy. And for me, and I know you work with Mormon women, I've had religious clients find that fact very healing. I had one client say to me, wow, like God must have intended me to have pleasure if he gave me an organ that was just for pleasure. And so I think it's really important to underscore its uniqueness.
I couldn't agree more. I talk often with Mormon women about that. And we have the added theology of, although we don't talk about her much, the idea that we also have a heavenly mother, that God really comprises from a heavenly father and a heavenly mother. And we believe in embodied gods, right? So that these gods have bodies of their own. That's part of why we're here on this earth, is to get a body and to become like a god in that way. So that's Mormon theology for you.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that. I love learning it.
So, and not that we want to be sacrilegious or disrespectful, but I often talk about the idea that if we really believe that, then Heavenly Father has a penis, right? And Heavenly Mother has a vulva and a clitoris and a mons pubis and inner labia and outer labia. And although that may feel weird to think about it that way, or again, like maybe, am I being disrespectful by thinking about it that way? And yet, if we're really going to buy into our own theology, the idea that we're created in God's image and created with these very intricate, special parts that, like you're saying, have potential for pleasure and for connection and for almost like out-of-body experiences, right? You mentioned that orgasm is the moment where really you can't think about anything else. Like when you surrender to orgasm and to that pleasure, everything else shuts off and your entire being for those few seconds or minutes.
Exactly.
That's what you're doing. So I think that there's a lot of potential there for a spiritual kind of concept or a divine concept to help women deal with unnecessary sexual shaming or some of these other messages that we've received through puritanical Christianity or some of these other ways that shame has seeped into our lived experiences.
Yeah, I think I couldn't say it any better. I mean, that's just so beautiful. Yes. I mean, it is, the moment, it is a spiritual experience. It can be a spiritual experience. And, we could look at the spiritual aspect or the neuropsychology of it, but the bottom line is, or the mindfulness of it, that moment leading up to an orgasm, you are fully in this, sort of in body, out of body experience. Nothing else is there. And that is spiritual. And I do believe that, we are intended to have that pleasure. And, we have to, as women, learn there is a way for us to get this pleasure. We have that pleasure capacity, but we have to honor it. We have to honor our most reliable routes to orgasm when we're with a partner, just like we're honoring their most reliable route, instead of trying to conform ours to theirs or vice versa.
Yeah, and you also say men can't read minds and they also can't read vaginas. So I liked that little, I want to turn that into a little bumper sticker.
Please do.
Because I think that really highlights the importance of communication and being able to not only show up, but speak up and, advocate for yourself, as a woman, which are not things that I think women are typically taught how to do. And so it's not that we're expecting that you should know these things, but that's a lot of what you have in the book are really great ideas and very hands-on approaches to being able to start this type of journey. Do you want to talk a little bit about women who have never experienced orgasm or who even come in and say things to me like, it feels good and I think I feel a bit of a buildup, but I'm not really sure if I'm having an orgasm?
Yeah, I would love to talk about that. And I'd love to hear what you do as well. and share that knowledge back and forth. Sometimes, a lot of people say if you don't know that you're having one, you probably aren't. On the one hand. On the other hand, sometimes people are having orgasms, but their expectations are out of line. They're waiting for like the whole house to shake, and it just quivers a little. But my advice usually is you will really know when it happens, and you have to give yourself time to learn. And that goes back to looking at and touching your own body. That like, if we, men go to the bathroom, they hold their penis their whole life. They get lots of familiarity with it. Women often go their entire life without even looking at their vulva or, feel disgusted if they do. And if you don't know what you have and you're not comfortable looking at it, touching it, and you're not going to understand what does bring you pleasure. And so in situations like that, I tell people to pleasure themselves. I give instructions for that. I have those instructions in the book. And when people are resistant to that, because so many of us have received such negative messages about self-pleasure, I do one of two things. I say there's really good evidence that that's a healthy activity, and I cite all the research about how healthy it is. I talk about how it's, an essential step in all sex therapy treatments. I say, if it's more comfortable for you, I'll write you a prescription for this. This is my best medical advice for you. And then getting back to the religious piece, and I have this in the book, I love this quote that I found that we're created so that our hands can reach our genitals. And I don't think that was done as a test, so we wouldn't. I think it was done because we're supposed to be able to give ourselves that pleasure and that release. And the best way for women, people with vulvas, to do that is to slowly learn how to do it themselves, and then use that good communication to transfer that to sex with a partner. I'm curious if that's
I love that. Yeah. And so let me back you up as far as from my Mormon perspective, because I do know this is a tricky part. Most, Mormons, in fact, when I first started delving into sexuality, it was kind of by accident. I started a blog and thinking, okay, I'll just answer mental health questions. Well, you start a place where people can start asking questions anonymously. Guess what? Most of my questions started becoming about. It was about sex. Right?
Yes.
And then I was like, oh, maybe I should study up on sex a little bit more. And that's kind of my journey of how I started, with my certification as a sex therapist and stuff. So, and most of the questions coming in, I thought was really interesting from this perspective of, is it okay if we do this? These were primarily married Mormon, active in their religion type of people, asking basically for permission for whether or not what we're doing is righteous or sinful, or, from that perspective of, would God be okay with the type of sex that we're having, or the type of things that we're wanting to explore? So I thought that was really interesting from several perspectives. One, because, in Mormonism, the one area where there is some direction around guidelines for married people is in the bishop's handbook. And it's fairly hands-off. Which I'm appreciative of. There's a paragraph in there that says something like, as long as you're not being coercive or manipulative or abusive, then, it's really kind of up to the couple to decide what they're going to do. Now, granted, I'm not naive enough to not understand that there are definitely some things that even if a couple came in and said we're both okay with, that a bishop probably wouldn't still, not be maybe offering some, I guess, discipline around. For example, anything with pornography or erotica, that wouldn't be considered okay, even in a marriage. And I think masturbation is another one, because masturbation is oftentimes taught from the perspective of adolescence. And even though there's nothing really using the word masturbation currently, there's lots of words like don't sexually arouse yourself. Well, I think most of us would say that probably has to do with masturbation, even though they're not saying the word. So for many, many Mormons, masturbation is considered a sin, and that doesn't change necessarily once they're married. And so this is an issue that we talk about. Now, granted, those who are familiar with my work know that this is not a position I agree with. So I we really don't have a lot of doctrinal or scriptural reasons why that would be backed up. I think it is more one of those kinds of things that just got culturally biased, just like we used to think that Blacks were not righteous enough or good enough to hold the priesthood. We've done a fairly okay job as a church at looking back at some of our older ideas and saying, yeah, that probably didn't come from God. That probably was something that was culturally biased at the time. And so that's my position on some of these ideas around masturbation for a lot of the reasons that you're talking about. So one is we know that sexual release is important. We know that that's actually part of the health of your physical body. We also know that you're not always going to be in a position in your life where you can have relational sex, whether you're too young or you're widowed or you're divorced or you have a developmental disorder that maybe never allowed you to have a partner. And so I find it actually very loving, again, from that perspective of how we were created, which is what you mentioned, that there's capacity for sexual pleasure and sexual release when you're not in a relationship, not able to maybe partner with somebody through a marriage. And then the other part is that I think that once you are married, these ideas about self-pleasuring, as long as they're done in alignment with other values, like honesty, like we want to prioritize our sex life together, like we want to experience pleasure, and we want to really have a sexual journey as a married couple. There's a lot of room there to incorporate, self-pleasuring and masturbation, whether you do that solo, whether you do that together, whether, there's just, that can become part of your sexual negotiations as a couple. And so I think therefore falls in line with that paragraph that I was talking about, where it's kind of up to you to decide whether or not you want to do that. And I oftentimes have couples, just to let people know that there's a lot of different types of Mormons out there than what you might think you are, is that there's Mormons that come in and are like, oh, masturbation, they might say a few things about it, but that's really no big deal. Like, that's not really a big deal at all, and are perfectly comfortable with it, and are perfectly comfortable with the fact that they did it when they were teens and still comfortable with it as a married couple. There are other Mormons that are very, very rigid about it and are going in and confessing every time they masturbate, to their bishop. And I think that there's also quite a bit of couples where there's a disagreement about it. Yeah. So where the man, for example, might be really excited to hear me say something like, well, have we thought about helping you, the wife who is having problems with orgasm? Could we consider, maybe playing around with some of these prescriptions, like you're saying? And she's very upset and uptight about it. And like, you're asking me to do something sinful. Whereas his perspective might be very different. And it can go the other way around as well, where she's excited to explore her body and be given permission to think about that, but he's nervous that I'm asking them to do something sinful. So those are all happening right now in our current climate, within Mormonism, where there's a lot of disagreement and different perspectives around this particular issue. But again, supporting it from a Mormon lens so that we can talk about it, because I think this is such an important part of your book. We were created with bodies. Bodies are, we are told that we are created to experience joy and pleasure. That's a big part of Mormonism. And we have, female anatomy that supports that idea, like you've mentioned. And we want to have a sexual journey with our spouse that will be pleasurable for both of us, because we know that people who are having good and satisfying sexual encounters tend to have better satisfying marriages. There's, like you said, a lot of health benefits, a lot of ways to deal with stress and even chronic pain through sexual release. For women, that can be really important through menstrual cramping, through having babies, all of the difficulties, right, of female anatomy can really be offset by a lot of this pleasure that we can experience. So I think it can be a really fun exercise and a righteous exercise to consider this from that perspective of, I get to explore the body God gave me, and I get to then share that with my husband in ways that will only edify our relationship. And one last thing I'll say about this is just the scripture that talks about the fruit. By the fruit, you shall know it, right? And so sometimes I feel like masturbation gets blamed for things. And I'm like, how about other things? Because if you're doing masturbation in secret from your spouse and they never know that you're masturbating and you're hiding a huge aspect of your sexuality, is that masturbation's fault, or is that dishonesty's fault, right? And so I try to, that's not really masturbation's fault, right?
Yes.
If you're doing it in a way where you're both on board, where you know what your goals are, where you're really wanting to connect and use this as a tool, as one of the tools that get you in a space where you feel really comfortable and enjoying each other, well, then now the fruit is edifying. The fruit tastes good. It's not this yucky thing that feels, secretive and awful and like a betrayal, maybe even.
I love everything you said. And I love that you can help people talk about this and see this from a different perspective than they might have learned, and certainly I can't add to the religious piece of it, but I can add to the research piece of it, that research is, and maybe this helps people to know that, if the ultimate goal is, good marital sex, research is really clear that people who pleasure themselves or masturbate have more, not less sex with a partner, because the more sex you have, and I don't mean by intercourse again, the more sexual pleasure you have, the more sexual pleasure you want. So this is not only sort of a prescription for people who are trying to figure out how to orgasm, it's also a prescription for low desire. One way to crank up your own desire is to start pleasuring yourself. So, it is a myth that that it detracts from relationship sex. The research is just so clear that it adds to your desire and satisfaction with a partner if you take time to pleasure yourself without a partner. And I agree with that openness thing. I don't usually do this, but just will share a personal story. My husband was just away on business for 2 weeks. And he came back last night and we had dinner and we were, catching up, although we'd stayed in pretty good touch every day, talking on the phone a couple times a day. But we hadn't talked about this on the phone. And I just said, how often did you masturbate the last 2 weeks? And he answered my question and he said, how often did you masturbate? And I told him, and then, it was just part of the honest discussion of what did we do while we were apart? And it felt open and honest and connected. It was something we shared and discussed rather than shamefully hid from one another.
Right. Well, and since you're telling personal stories, I'd love for you to share the story about when, was it that you were in the bathtub or your mom was in the bathtub? Somebody was in the bathtub when you were a young girl, and kind of the message your mother gave you about your body.
Oh, I would love to tell that story. And if it's not too much for listeners, I also feel, I want to tell you, it feels very meaningful for me to tell you this. My mom is still alive, but she has a terminal diagnosis and she's in the dying process right now. And this is her, thank you. But this story in the book, it made her so happy when I read it, to her. So there's a big sidebar and it says, thanks, Mom. And basically it tells the very true story that I think I was about 8 or 9 and I'd been masturbating. And I heard that it was so bad that I was committing this terrible, terrible thing. And I got up all my courage to tell my mother, and it took a lot of courage. And my mother used to take these long, luxurious baths. I mean, that was her thing. She'd lay in the tub for an hour every night, which is great self-care. And we weren't supposed to disturb her, but I finally got the courage and I knocked on the door and she said, come in, because we're only supposed to disturb her when it was very, very important. And I said, I need to tell you something really. And I said, I've been touching myself down there. And she just said, oh, please don't interrupt my bath for that. She said, everyone does that. Now just do it with your door closed. Now leave and let me take my bath. And it was just so like, oh, this isn't a big deal. Like, it's certainly not important enough to disturb her bath, and just keep doing it because everyone does it, but close your door. Okay. And that was such a sex positive message. So I
Very
appreciate
normalizing.
Yes.
Very like,
Yes.
no big deal, giving you some direction around privacy.
Mm-hmm.
That was it.
That was it.
Yeah. That's phenomenal.
So as I say to readers in the book, if you didn't get that message, channel my mom, pretend she's saying it to you. You know, she would be very honored if anybody out there heard her saying that to them.
That's beautiful. Well, that's a wonderful way to honor your mom, especially now. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
You also have a quote by Lonnie Barbuck, and I want to read this as well. She says, Margaret Mead found that in the human female, the potentiality for orgasm is a cultural factor. If a society considers orgasmic release of the female important, then the essential lovemaking techniques which ensure the woman's orgasm will be learned and practiced. If the female orgasm is considered unimportant, the members of the culture will not practice the techniques essential to orgasmic release in the woman, and women are likely to be anorgasmic. And this is where I think as Mormons, we have a lot of potential to challenge ourselves, because we do, like I said, we do have the sex positive frameworking for prioritizing female orgasm, and yet the reality is that it's not the lived experience, I think, of most women, maybe due to other factors, other Christian factors or puritanical factors or patriarchal factors and overall culture, right? Because obviously as Mormon women, we live in American culture as well, where we get a lot of messages around male-centric sexuality. So this idea that we want to really own the sex positive parts of Mormonism and prioritize female orgasm, I think is something that we can really wrap our hands around. And I'd like to finish with a little bit of just kind of some hands-on approaches, so you talk about the clitoris, for example, which is that kind of button type part right on top of the mons pubis that has a, little hood. And that's where a lot of the sensations and the nerve endings are. I think if I remember correctly, it has like 3 times or 10 times something, the nerve endings of the penis, right? As far as the head of the penis, which tends to be one of the most sensitive areas for a man. Some women like direct stimulation on that area. Other women, it gets to be a little bit too much if it's directly stimulated, and why it's important also to play with the labia, right? So the inner labia has quite a few nerve endings, if I remember reading that right in your book, as well as even the mons pubis. So that fatty area right on top of the clitoral area, that may feel silly that feels good, but all of that feels good. So do you want to talk about just some of the logistics around exploring
things I would
like
love to.
The G-spot, the clitoris, the labia, vibrators,
yes,
vibrators.
I really advocate. It takes some time, get a picture of a vulva, and there's one in my book, you can get them other places. And I have instructions for this. The first thing is to sit with a mirror privately on a bed, look at yourself, find those parts. And yes, the clitoral hood is analogous to the foreskin. The clitoral glands is to the head of the penis. The inner lips are also analogous to the head of the penis, chock full of nerve endings. And as you say, some women find direct clitoral stimulation on the hood very, erotic. Others find it too much, and that actually the inner lips are attached to the clitoral hood. So if you kind of stimulate those and move those, it moves the clitoris. So basically learning what's there, and then finding and just spending time, 15 minutes a day as you get used to it, using some lubricant, using a vibrator, using your hands, touching yourself. And in the book, I give different ways, different suggested most common ways to touch oneself, different finger motions. There's also an amazing website. I don't know if this would be okay, if it would be considered porn or not. It's an educational website. It's OMG Yes.
I refer to it often.
Okay, good.
Yes.
Yeah. So it shows women touching themselves. So it's great role modeling. Betty Dotson has some great videos also showing There's one I show in my class called Becoming Orgasmic Carol, where she teaches a woman how to masturbate to orgasm. So just slowly, if you've not done it before, just like anything else new, it's going to feel awkward and weird at first, but the more you practice, the more comfortable and orgasmic the experience comes. And be patient, give yourself time. You're adjusting to a new learning. I had a client who first looked at herself after she got my book, and she was like, it was disgusting. I felt nauseous. And I was like, we got to keep looking at it till you don't. You go home and do it again. Mm-hmm. And she'd never had an orgasm. And she looked at it a second time, felt less averse. A third time, started to think maybe it's kind of cool looking. Pretty soon she was comfortable. I'm going to touch myself. And, it took about 3 or 4 months, and now she's orgasming. And it's really essential to know what you're touching and understand your anatomy. That way you'll understand. So that's my kind of, I'd say quick and dirty, but it's not dirty.
Yeah, that's right.
That's my quick instructions.
That's right. Yeah. And I loved that you had so many messages in there about not worrying whether you're having the right type of orgasm. Again, like that G-spot, that's somewhat of a controversial idea anyway. It's kind of talking about that area inside of the vaginal wall that's closest to your abdomen. So kind of that front part of the vaginal wall, which, when you're rubbing that, you're kind of rubbing up against the urethral, spongy type of part of you. And so that can kind of give a little bit of a tickly sensation for some, or for some people, it's actually not very comfortable and isn't pleasurable. For others, it is. And so what? Who cares? It's not the right type of orgasm. It's one of those things that if you touch, if you explore and it feels good, great. And if it doesn't, it doesn't.
Exactly.
Well, that you talk about different ways women masturbate. Some women masturbate lying on their back. I think you said like 75% of women tend to be most, again, reliable in their orgasmic potential if they're lying on their back, or that's the way that they find it most reliable. Other women are more on their stomach, rubbing up against something soft like a pillow or something along those lines. Some women like to use their own fingers. Some women don't. There's no one right way.
There is not. And the one thing I say in the book that I'd love to underscore is that the best way to have an orgasm with a partner is to transfer your self-pleasure techniques to that partnered sex. So, I talk about if there's no way that is not without a little creativity can't be transferred to partner sex, but figuring what that is out first. So I talk to people about, well, if you are a tummy masturbator, that can be transferred to partner sex. You can touch yourself while your partner enters you from behind. Like with some creativity, you can transfer those self-pleasure methods to partner sex.
That's right. And I think also too why women on top can oftentimes feel orgasmic, because they can then rub themselves up against kind of pelvic bone or kind of body parts of their husband, while they're on top, because that's mimics their own ability to rub up against something that they were doing when they were masturbating.
Exactly. Although for some women, that's just not direct enough.
Yeah.
So again, it's what do you need? And then being open and honest to discuss that and to communicate that and to feel that it's important enough that you get that pleasure and that you get it the way that works, not the pretend way, going back to the fake orgasms that you think you're supposed to.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, good. And then just really briefly, I think you mentioned something about the self-cleaning oven, right? So no need to insert any cleansing things or things of that nature. Again, a lot of times women's genitals have been seen as quote unquote dirty or yucky or smelly or those kinds of things. We really need to focus on accepting our genitalia the way they are. You talk about genital hair, that there seems to be a big trend towards genital hair removal. Or even plastic surgery around genitalia. So a lot of that comes from, again, the media, right? And a lot of unrealistic expectations, unfortunately, around things like that. So just the more you can accept your own self, the better. And you even have a picture in the book, which I think comes from the Petals book or something, but there's several places where you can go just look at a bunch of vulvas. And to your point with the masturbation videos, I do not see this as pornography. Education is different than pornography. And again, a lot of that has to do with your intent on how you're using these materials, because, and there's a big difference between educational videos that are meant to educate and what you would see in classic pornography anyway. Being open to seeing that, because vulvas and labia come in all different shapes and sizes. And there's so many women who I think feel like ugly or that deformed or that there's something wrong because they don't look a certain way, that, the kind of classic slit that's just this very tiny little vulva that's usually shown either in illustrations or that's the type of labia that's prioritized in pornographic images.
Absolutely. Exactly. So important that we all look different. Most inner labia protrude out, and it's so important to look, to know. And I agree, it's funny. I'll tell you a story. When I taught my human sexuality class, I, put a proposal to the curriculum committee at my college. And I said, there's a warning in my syllabus. I'm going to show videos of naked people, basically, and this and that. And so I got called to the provost's office saying, why are you showing pornography in your class? And I said, I'm not. Where did you get that idea? He said, well, in your syllabus, it says you show, I said, well, that's a warning so people know what they're getting into. He said, well, what's the difference between what you're showing and pornography? And I said, the goal of pornography is to excite. The goal of these education materials is to educate. People may feel excited as a byproduct because we're visual people and visually aroused, but the intent is not to excite, is to educate.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
And most Mormons I know go to museums where there's naked people, and we're not running out of there like with our eyes covered. So there's room. In fact, our own temples have, at least, the idea that Adam and Eve were naked, and not that we're showing their whole nakedness, but there should be a certain level of comfort with the naked body that Mormons can tolerate in order to educate themselves and, again, prioritize this really important part of themselves. So, well, thank you. I know we covered tons of material. I cannot recommend this book enough. We only really touched the very tip of the iceberg, right? So we touched the tip of the clitoris here in Becoming Cliterate. And I really recommend diving in and taking, some of Laurie's ideas. And she just does such a great job of offering so many different just tips and different things that you can try. Because I know that for women, it can be so incredibly frustrating to feel like, I'm continually failing at this, or that I'm not being successful, or that I'm taking too long, or all those things. So it can just be really helpful to have this type of resource that normalizes your experience and then actually gives you hands-on, doable things that you can try today, if you want to, and that you can invite your partner to engage with you on as well, if you're interested in that. So any closing thoughts from you as far as, last things you'd like to leave us with?
No, I'm just honored that you like the book so much and that you're recommending it. And I just really hope that the listeners will embrace their pleasure, their most reliable route to orgasm, as legitimate and more than legitimate, as right, and that there's a right and a, empowerment to pleasure. So.
Amen. I totally agree. I totally agree. Thank you so much for your time. It's very valuable, and I can't thank you enough for sharing it with us.
Well, thank you.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles, and as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
It's been a long road here, a trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary, it's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary. No, it's extraordinary.